One question changed the entire mood of this hearing. What is the real cost of war? And when Senator Blumenthal pressed the Pentagon for answers, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth didn't just defend the war. He accused critics and the media of deceiving the American people. What followed was one of the most explosive exchanges yet over Iran, military spending, and whether Americans are being told the full truth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. I want to talk about the costs of war. The costs of war include caring for our veterans. We've had an estimate from Mr. Hurst yesterday that the cost to date in dollars for this war has been $25 billion, which I believe is well below the actual cost based on everything that I've heard, everything available to us in various kinds of settings, and I'm going to ask for a more accurate assessment. But we also know that about 400 service members have been wounded as a result of this war. When they retire, when they come home, their retirement pay will be docked dollar for dollar for every disability benefit dollar they receive. Secretary Hegseth, I'd like your commitment that you will support the Major Richard Starr Act that will eliminate this wounded warrior tax. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Tens of thousands of servicemen and women now are reduced in their retirement pay literally for every dollar of disability benefits they receive.
Well, I appreciate your focus on this issue, and I will tell you of the, you mentioned roughly 400 that have been injured. Thankfully, over 90% are returned to duty. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't have a residual challenge. And we're tracking that at point of injury to ensure that that is noted, even though they're returned to duty.
But what I'd like is your commitment that you will support the Major Richard Starr.
As I have said in the past to other organizations, we support the Richard Starr Act.
Thank you. On the issue of cost, Mr. Hurst, does that $25 billion estimate include all of the costs in terms of damage to our bases, the need to replace planes and munitions, and the costs of injuries to our servicemen and women?
Senator, so for the MilCon facilities replacement cost, that's probably the hardest thing to estimate right now because we don't know what our future posture is going to be or the future construction of those bases.
Well, you owe it to us. You're here to ask for appropriations.
Of course.
And I would like a more accurate estimate of what has been done that will require replacement and renovation, as well as the other costs. And I think $25 billion is probably less than half, maybe less than a quarter of the total cost of war, which is the reason why the supplemental request is much higher. So I think you owe it to the American people to give us the straight talk about what the costs have been. Mr. Secretary, I know you have characterized this war as an astonishing military success, to use your words yesterday. But the American people aren't buying it. And I know you feel the American people are seeing through the abstruse stuff that is thrown at them, but one point is irrefutable, which is America never succeeds in war unless the American people are behind it. And if what you're seeing as success now is winning, I would hate to see what losing looks like, because none of the shifting and contradictory objectives of the war so far have been achieved. Likewise, let me ask you, yesterday the President said that Ukraine has been, quote, militarily defeated. I assume you don't agree with that assessment.
The negative nature in which you characterize the incredible and historic effort in Iran is part of the reason, Senator, why the American people view it the way they do. It's why I looked out at our press corps at the Pentagon and called them the Pharisees in the press. because they look for every problem.
Well, I'm asking you about
You look for every
Ukraine.
problem that
Do you believe
exists,
Ukraine
and you
has been
miss
militarily defeated?
you miss the
I would
plank.
submit, based on my 9 trips to Ukraine, that is a false narrative that the president's
We are
buying
2
from
months
Vladimir
into a
Putin.
historic military success in Iran, and
will
you want to call it a
dispute it
defeat. And it's
because
defeatist Democrats
it
like
is
you
the
that
people
cloud the
of
mind of the
Ukraine
American
who are
people
fighting
and
for their
would otherwise
survival,
fully support
fight no
preventing
help
Iran from having a
the
nuclear weapon.
administration, and they are bravely fighting our fight. And that is the reason that I'm pursuing the Russian sanctions bill, which is bipartisan, along with Senator Graham, and why I hope we will recognize our obligation to release that $400 million, which we've appropriated.
Thank you, Senator.
This hearing exposed something much bigger than a clash between Senator Richard Blumenthal and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. What we watched was 2 completely different versions of reality colliding in public. Blumenthal came into this hearing talking about the actual costs of war. Not slogans. Not chest thumping. Not victory speeches. Real costs. Money. Injuries. Long-term care for veterans. The hidden price America keeps paying long after the headlines disappear. And notice how he framed it right from the start. He didn't begin with geopolitics or military strategy. He began with wounded service members. Around 400 Americans injured in this conflict. And then he brought up something most Americans probably have never even heard about: disabled veterans losing retirement pay dollar for dollar because of the disability benefits they receive. That's what the Major Richard Starr Act is about. Ending what critics call the wounded warrior tax. In other words, soldiers who sacrifice their health for the country are effectively being financially penalized afterward. That is a devastating political argument because it cuts through partisan noise immediately. And for a brief moment, you could actually see bipartisan agreement in the hearing. Hegseth agreed to support the act. But then the conversation shifted from veterans to the bigger issue the administration clearly did not want to fully engage with: the true cost of this war. Blumenthal challenged the Pentagon's estimate of $25 billion, arguing that number likely excludes massive long-term expenses: rebuilding damaged bases, replacing destroyed equipment, caring for injured troops, future medical costs, and operational losses that won't show up immediately on paper. And honestly, this is where the hearing became politically dangerous for the administration, because Americans have heard this before. Every modern war starts with optimistic projections. Short timeline, limited cost, strategic success. Then years later, the real numbers come out and the public discovers the actual price tag was exponentially higher. That's the shadow hanging over this hearing. Blumenthal was essentially saying, don't sell the public another sanitized version of war. But then Hegseth pivoted hard into culture war territory instead of directly answering the underlying concern. And this is where the hearing took a dramatic turn. When Blumenthal questioned whether the war could truly be called a success, Hegseth didn't just defend the military operation. He accused critics and the media of poisoning public perception itself. That's a very important political strategy to understand. Instead of debating whether the objectives have actually been achieved, the argument becomes, the mission succeeded, but the media refuses to admit it. That shifts blame away from policy outcomes and onto journalists, Democrats, and public skepticism. And Hegseth escalated it even further by invoking the phrase defeatist Democrats. That wasn't accidental. That was messaging aimed directly at the administration's political base. Because this hearing was not just about Iran anymore. It became part of a broader ideological battle over patriotism, military power, and who gets to define reality during wartime. Blumenthal's argument was essentially this: America cannot sustain a war if the public loses trust in the mission. And historically, he's not wrong. Military victories alone do not sustain public support. Political credibility does. Transparency does. Clear objectives do. Trust does. Vietnam proved that. Iraq proved that. Afghanistan proved that. Americans may initially rally behind military action, but public opinion shifts quickly when objectives become unclear, costs keep rising, and officials appear more focused on messaging than accountability. That's why this exchange matters. Because underneath all the shouting was a fundamental question every democracy faces during conflict. Who tells the truth about war? Is it the Pentagon? The White House? The media? Congress? or the American people watching all of this unfold and trying to decide who they still trust? And then there was another revealing moment buried in the exchange. While Hegseth aggressively defended the administration's handling of Iran, Blumenthal pivoted to Ukraine and Russia, warning against abandoning U.S. commitments abroad. That matters because it exposes a growing fracture inside American foreign policy itself. One side argues strength means projecting overwhelming military force and demanding unquestioned national unity behind it. The other argues strength also requires honesty, alliances, accountability, and long-term strategic credibility. That divide is becoming one of the defining political battles in Washington right now. And politically, Hegseth's response may energize loyal supporters, but it also carries risk. Calling critics defeatist can rally a base during wartime, but it can also alienate independents who simply want answers about costs, casualties, and objectives. Because most Americans are not military strategists, they're asking basic questions. How much is this costing? What is the end goal? How long will this last? And are we being told the full truth? Those are not anti-American questions. Those are democratic questions. And this hearing showed just how defensive the administration has become when those questions are asked publicly. If anything, the exchange revealed that the battle over this war is no longer just happening overseas. It is now happening politically inside Congress, inside the media, and inside the American public itself. And that political battle may ultimately determine the future of the war, just as much as anything happening on the battlefield. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe to The State Lens because we cut through the headlines and explain the political strategy, power struggles,